Everyone for coming. We are very happy to have Nathan Nunn from Harvard University for our last workshop, Ostrom workshop of the semester. He's going to give a talk on, or not give a talk, but the workshop. The paper is going to be on evolution of culture. And so you know the format of the workshop, so you are going to give a summary in 5 to 7 minutes, and then there will be questions from the audience.
Okay, great. So thanks, Lee, for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here, and thanks for everyone for coming, and looking forward to all of your comments and criticisms and questions. I just want to touch on a few things. I won't literally provide an overview of everything, because I think you've read it. Just want to highlight a few things. So the first is just the motivation. So a lot of research I've done in the past has looked at persistence, whether it's historical persistence, historical events affecting things today, and that could be through institutions. But I've kind of come to believe that a big part of this is persistence is through what I call culture. And so you can think of these as values, beliefs. Some people would call these norms. We can probably, I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion about what we're talking about. But these are values and beliefs that are intrinsic to the individual, internal to the individual, about how we should do things, about what's the right way to do things. Okay? And there's lots of examples of persistence, but then there's lots of examples of change. So there's work by Margaret Mead, Raymond Firth, Joel Robbins, where they basically are doing ethnographies, this is in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, in different societies, and really document the dramatic changes that occur. So a lot of islands off of Papua New Guinea, for example, where it's a dramatic change from traditional way of doing things to basically adopting a more Western culture. So we have, and the Protestant Reformation would be another example of dramatic change. So we have persistence, we have change. Well, how can we have both, and how do we understand when do certain beliefs, customs persist, and when don't they? So the way to think of this is, the question that's related is, well, when do certain societies really hold on to their traditions? When do societies look at the next generation, and if the next generation is doing something different than what they did, or is believing something different, that's a real problem, right? And you exert a lot of effort into maintaining the traditions with your kids. And so we can think of certain societies just in Europe, societies from southern Italy, for example, Greece, relative to Sweden, there is a difference, right? So I think in Sweden, there's more of a view of, younger generations, they may do things differently, and I think that's acceptable, right? And so that was a question I was interested in. I guess where I'm coming from is evolutionary anthropology, where I remember in grad school reading Boyd and Richardson have a book where they have mathematical models, and they actually already had an answer to this question back in 1985. And in these models, there was a clear prediction. It's the stability of the environment. Okay, and so basically, I think the intuition is important to understand. Over time, cultures or values and beliefs evolve, right? Certain beliefs or certain values are better than others. Okay, so think of a world where the environment can change, and depending on the environment, what's the optimal value or belief or culture? So are we really aggressive? Are we, or are we more passive, for example? Are we super religious? Are we less religious? It would be just, there's a million examples. What food do we eat? And so over time, through evolutionary processes, right, if there's nothing changing, the culture that's going to evolve and it's going to survive is going to be relatively good. Okay? So then the culture that's evolved up until my parents' generation, there's valuable information in that, right? That's a pretty good culture. But what if my parents' environment, their generation, the environment is completely different than my environment, right? And so what was optimal in their setting is different than mine, then that culture has no value. If the environments are exactly the same, then that culture has a ton of value. And it's a pretty good strategy to just follow blindly that culture, right? And so that's the sense in which the environment, the stability of the environment, affects the extent to which me more blindly following my parents' culture is going to be beneficial. Okay? If the environment changes 100%, then there's no value in my parents' culture, and I better just think for myself what's the best thing to do. That's the nature of the model, and that's kind of the mechanism. So the empirics are essentially just exactly testing this, right? So I won't go through that, but I think that's really the importance, and I think there's I think what's the significance of this? Well, one is understanding when culture persists, when it doesn't. But I think the other important significance is it's actually a test of this large class of models. And it's a test. I cited one lab experiment that's been done, but other than that, there really hasn't been a test of this class of models. So why is this class of models important? In economics, I think we're coming to realize that, well, understanding norms or understanding culture is important because, you know, Homo economicus doesn't quite explain the world. There's a lot in behavioral economics. But so then people are developing models like George Akerlof, for example, where you have, or Guido Tabellini, where you have something else in the model, which is culture or identity or something. And so people are deviating from being rational and following a norm or a belief about what the right thing is to do. But that's assumed, right? That's not micro-founded at all. And these class of models by Boyd and Richardson and others, basically they derive that endogenously, right? There's value, it's a better strategy actually to have a tradition and then follow the tradition, right? And so in the model, there's always, if you think of the traditionalists and the non-traditionalists are like the rational people, right? Traditionalists, you're going to follow something blindly, even though it could appear to not be optimal. There's always traditionalists in equilibrium, right? There's always traditionalists. And one insight is, well, if all of you are rational economists, I come along, I'm a blind traditionalist, I just do what everyone else does, well, I'm going to have the best, I'm going to adopt the right action because all of you guys have figured out the right action, and I'm not going to bear the costs of figuring out the right action, right? And so that's why, something like a belief that, I should just do what everyone, what people did the previous generation or what everyone else around me is doing, in other words, identity or cultural belief, is actually going to be evolutionarily beneficial, and it's going to arise endogenously, okay? And so I think this is important because we're testing models that micro-found a lot of the literature now in cultural economics or behavioral economics or economics of identity. So I think that's another contribution. And I'll stop there. So, okay, thanks.
Yes. Yep. You go ahead.
So before, I suspect there will be a lot of questions on the methods, the data, and so on. But before we go there, I thought I would just ask you if you've thought about the parallel between what you're doing here, the kinds of questions you're asking, and those Demsetz talks about in terms of property rights.
Okay.
Which is, he has a very utilitarian approach, and yours is kind of a utilitarian approach to tradition, where his is to property rights. But it struck me that there was a real similarity where you go, well, where does this come from? Why does it stick around? And it has to do with when something changes and something becomes more valuable, then we assign property rights to it. So it's this notion of a change of some sort. In your case, environmental. In his case, it could be a technological change or something. But it might be fun to pursue that a bit.
Okay. So no, I definitely haven't thought about that. I have nothing so I have nothing kind of smart to say about it.
Well, that's okay.
about the link between the two.
Most of our speakers don't.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll have to think about the similarities between the two. Okay, that's a good point.
Well, I'll ask the question that I guess is going to come up eventually about what exactly culture is. And let me actually preface it by saying I really like this analysis.
Yep.
And I think it's really an important thing to do because it's a term that's used all the time.
Right.
And actually it reminds me a bit of another term that's used all the time, which is institutions. And people sort of have an idea. It's like one of these, that's an institution. We sort of can point to them, but it's really hard to really be very specific and precise about what an institution is. And I think it's just as hard, at least for culture, but it also is sort of a similar kind of thing, it seems to me, that what you're addressing here. I mean, should we think about, because you say that culture matters to the extent, I mean, that's sort of your premise. It matters, the premise of your analysis. It matters to the extent it affects behavior, right? I mean, if culture is just, I wear green on St. Patrick's Day, that's probably, not very important to anything. But what matters more is, how I behave and how I interact with my environment. That seems to be the story you're telling. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and I like that approach to it. But then I start thinking, so is this a sort of just an informal institution? Is that how we should be thinking about it, as a rules of the game kind of thing? Or is it some kind of a residual after these formal and institutional, informal institutions have been, affected behavior in their way, because they also only matter the effect that they're, the degree they're affecting behavior. And sort of how does it all fit together? Now, this is a huge question, probably spend a day discussing, but if you have any thoughts.
So let me give you kind of how I view these things, and then I'd be curious about how, whether it jives with what other people think or whether other people are using different terminology. So for me, the big difference between culture and institutions, and I think empirically, one reason for this definition is because empirically it's implementable, and so culture is something that's internal to the individual, right? And so it's internal values and beliefs about what's right, what should be done, how we cook our food, what clothes we wear. So I would include, do we wear green on St. Patrick's Day? That's a cultural trait. That's a cultural belief, right? And some societies are going to have that cultural trait, and others aren't. So empirically, you can see that once you define culture, values, and beliefs as internal to the individual, then you can start to think about how you measure them. Okay. So what you need to do then is make sure the external environment is all held constant, and then see, are people engaging, you mentioned behavior, in systematically different actions, right? Making different choices when they have the same actions, the same payoffs, the same rules of the game, the same institutions. And so then that's why I think culture is closely tied to behavioral economics. So for example, the dictator game, where you're given money, how much do you want to share with someone else? That's the same game, the same payoffs for everybody, but you find that cultures vary dramatically in how much they share. So,
just a quick follow-up. I mean, so North would include norms, right? As institutions. So how does a culture differ from a norm?
So Lee and I were just talking about this. I think there's two definitions of norms that are out there. One is norm is a repeated pattern of behavior. Okay, and the other one is a norm more like its internal values and beliefs. So that's the narrow definition. The narrow definition is culture. So you could call norms narrow definition. I just use norms less, because there's a bit of ambiguity about what norms mean. A repeated pattern of behavior, so why in our society is everything peaceful? You go to another society, Somalia, and there's a lot of warfare. Well, to say that's a norm is, to me, kind of a bit tautological or vacuous. So the repeated pattern of behavior is what we want to explain, right? So it could be because internal values and beliefs, some people are just more war-loving in certain parts of the world, or it could be institutions, or it could be informal institutions, which I would think is people sanctioning others, and that's obviously related to culture. So,
as a follow-up question.
Quick follow-up to his point, isn't it important to define the objective? I mean, why is it we have a tradition? Why do we? I think in your paper you seem to be concluding people respond to the environment. They take certain actions. For what?
Yeah.
I mean, am I trying to keep him from beating me up? Am I trying to make more money? Am I trying to have a bigger family? I mean, isn't and with the case of wearing green on St. Patrick's Day, I want a group identity, which may have an economic benefit or may not. I mean, so I was a little, in the model, and also in the empirical work, I was a little interested in, I mean, I was confused about what the objectives were, the traditions that people were taking. Are they trying to make more money? Are they trying to get a longer job, or decrease competition or increase competition? I mean, I'm curious about that.
So that's a great point. So what are the objectives?
Well, his point was a good point too.
Yeah. Well, no. Did I not say that for you? Now I have to make sure I say that to everybody. Everyone's going to be.
We're in a workshop.
It'll be good points and great points, maybe. So the objective. So the objective is interesting. I think what you also mentioned, I think the model is thinking about is, why do these things exist, right?
Right, sure.
So, and I think lots of the reasons when you talk, we can think of a lot of them. So an extreme case would be female genital mutilation, female cutting. There's not if you interview people, there's not a clear reason. This is just the tradition. This is what we think people should do. This is the way it should be done. And so people don't necessarily have to have a clear objective. They can in some cases, right? In some cases, if they have a clear objective, like I don't jaywalk because I think there's a high probability there's going to be a cop there and I'm going to get a ticket. I wouldn't call that a cultural norm or norm, the narrow definition. I would say, well, I'm just calculating costs and benefits, and I'm making, that's an outcome, and it's based on costs and benefits. And so there's different things that motivate us. Some are these internal values and beliefs. And your question, which is then, well, where do these internal values and beliefs and why? And I think the model does, I think this is one of the things that this model does in the class of models, is saying, well, why would these things ever arise? And if there was no benefit to just these beliefs, these what we call culture, tradition, then in the model there would never be any traditionalists. And we see that in equilibrium there are traditionalists, and the reason that they arise is, well, those traditions are shortcuts to good behavior, or behavior that's pretty good. So I think the best example is how maize is cooked in Latin America, right? So some of you may already know this. So the traditional way of cooking maize is the maize is dried, and then you boil the maize for about 40 minutes, and you mash it up into dough called masa. But an important step is before it boils, you throw in dirt, you throw in ash. Okay? And if you talk to people from Latin America, I remember giving a talk at University of British Columbia, and someone in the audience said, "Of course, why wouldn't you do that? How else are you going to cook it?" They were from Latin America. Aldo Musacchio said, "Oh, it gives you vitamin C." And so I looked it up. He said, "No, that's what my grandmother always told me. She does it because it gives you vitamin C." Turns out it doesn't give you vitamin C. Maybe that's not surprising. Dirt doesn't have high vitamin C content. And this is a professor at tenured professor at Brandeis. But there is a reason. Nobody knows it. There's no kind of motivation. The reason is that maize is deficient in niacin. So if you eat a lot of maize, have 70% of your calories from maize, you'll get pellagra, so a skin disease, get dementia, then you'll eventually die. So no one knew that that was the reason, but it evolved over time, and people felt really strongly that this is how we should cook. We should cook maize. And then what you find, there's a 1974 Science article that societies for which they relied primarily on maize cooked it this way. Other societies that didn't rely on maize as much and didn't suffer from pellagra didn't cook it this way. And then the last interesting thing is, after the Columbian Exchange, maize went from the Americas, where it was indigenous, to places like northern Italy with Sutu. The food traveled, but the cultural trait didn't travel. The tradition didn't travel. And then there were massive outbreaks of pellagra in northern Italy, where they're eating polenta, and also even still today in Lesotho, and they don't cook it. And there's lots of examples of this historically. So this would be an example where people don't have the intention, or they're not holding on to the tradition, but I think evolutionarily, there's something in us that's causing us to value tradition. And the difference across societies is what the paper is looking at. And so we don't know why we do a lot of things. We don't necessarily know why we wear green on St. Patrick's Day. And so I think that's kind of how I view it. Sometimes there's intention, but I think vast majority of the time we just think that's the right thing to do. And so we do it. We want that to continue. We don't know why. Yeah?
Thank you for the example. I am from Latin America.
Yeah?
Now I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Thank you for the paper. It was really enjoyable. And my concern or my question is about your definition of environment.
Right.
Because environment can be defined in so many things.
Yeah.
So I was surprised that here it is just related to climate change.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about whether it is possible to create a two-way or even a three-way interaction with other environmental shocks.
Yep.
Like, for example, with the regime change,
Yep.
with the natural disasters,
Yep.
and also it could be with civil conflict.
Yep.
And because that probably would generate better causal mechanisms. Why do we change the way that we do things? It's not just because of climate, it's
Yep.
just a external shock that forces us to do things in a different way.
Yeah.
So probably I would like to see this set of interactions, and in that way it would be a more embracing definition of environment.
Yeah, that's right. So the way to think of this is we don't think climate explains the vast majority of cultural change, and we didn't think that going in. There's lots of other changes to your environment. And so the reason we do this, and it's because we're coming from an economics background, is you can think that climate is exogenous in the sense that it's not affected at this time by human actions, right? And so empirically, when you look at the data, you can be pretty sure that the causality is going from climate to tradition. So if we did civil conflicts or economic growth over the last 500 years, it could be that places that value tradition less then were able to, have more civil wars or grow faster, or you could just tell whatever story you wanted to explain those results. And so that's the only reason. If you look at things like these other measures of these changes, you find that they line up similarly. But for economists, they say, oh, well, that's endogenous. How do we know that that causes that, not doesn't? And so that's the only reason. So not even that we think climate is the most important, but it was exogenous. And we could look at, if we have data, I should look and see how much historical data there is on earthquakes, for example. That would be another one. Yeah, exactly. And that would be exogenous, so that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's this notion that culture contains valuable information.
Right, yeah.
And that's why it persists.
Yeah.
That seems to me like an assertion.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that you need it. I'm not sure what it gets you, because there's counterexamples where it contains bad information.
Okay.
Iceland nearly starved for 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
They're surrounded by fish and they didn't fish.
Yep.
Because they didn't fish. Icelanders don't fish. They graze.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and we can think of other things that strike us as not, it's sort of as Chuck point, as in the objective function, that what does this get us? We do it because we do it. It seems like the right thing to do. My mother told me to do this, and I said thank you. And, that may turn out to have good benefits, but I don't see why you need that notion that culture contains valuable information and oftentimes information that's not so good, but you still survive.
Yeah. So it's testable, and then
testable.
and so.
Iceland, for example.
Yeah. So exactly what you're saying is completely consistent with the model, right? So the model says if you adopt this cultural trait, sometimes you'll be right, sometimes you'll be wrong, right? But what's the benefit of this is you don't have to bear that cost C, which is going out, figuring out what the optimal thing is to do. And so that's basically the trade-off, right? So in the case of pellagra and alkali processing maize, that cultural trait was good. In the case of Iceland, that cultural trait was bad, right? And in part, the environment had changed dramatically, right? And so, at least the environment that they're facing, the situation they're in. And so now they should have changed, but they held on to their old tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of gets at, I think, Claudia's point, that I think you need a shock big enough to get you over C.
Yeah, that's right.
That's all you need. But Iceland was nearly starving.
Yeah.
They were stunted, they were short, and then suddenly they become rich when they start fishing.
Yeah.
So but then it's true by definition.
No. So then the way I would think of this, what happened is then they would have updated, and this is in the model, right? Yeah. The extent to which they value tradition. They say, okay, if we would have just stuck and valued tradition, things would not have turned out well. Sometimes it's okay to break tradition. And it turns out that Iceland is extremely climatically variable. It's and so and if you look today, I'd have to look at the data and see how much do Icelanders value tradition compared to Southern Italians. I would assume less. So that's part of the mechanism. Yeah, I'm sure it's in the data. That's part of the mechanism. Is historically my ancestors, if I come from a variable environment, would have faced these shocks and would have been better off by changing their tradition. And then they said, over time, they start to realize tradition's not that valuable. Or in the model, the number of traditionalists decreases. In other societies where it's completely stable, you evolve to a good culture, and then nothing changes. So if you,
Just one follow-up. I think because all these things are about regressions and central tendencies, and that's fine.
Yeah.
So I always tell my students, go to his and you have the nice figures.
Right.
Go to his figures and look at the outliers.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it'd be interesting to tell some case studies about somebody on the mean, somebody who should have changed, didn't. The outliers are not what I might expect. Sometimes it was Egypt, sometimes it was Japan.
Yeah. The Japan's interesting.
Way not where I thought they should be. I mean, maybe I don't know Japan very well.
Yeah.
But anyways, I thought a next step when you turn this into a book
Yeah.
which I think you should do, is to provide some regressions with some case studies.
Yeah.
So we get more of a narrative as to when these things change and what's the shock that pushes you over, and so forth.
Yeah. I think there's some great case studies. Just one quick example is Margaret Mead studied the Manus Island in Perry. And there they had their houses on stilts in the water, moved off. They said, oh, that's wrong. We shouldn't fish. We should wear Western clothes. We should farm. In southern Benin, there's a society, Gambier, near Cotonou. They historically lived on these stilt houses, and they still live there. They didn't experience this. So why, in that setting, and they've converted to Christianity, and they've had similar pressures. So why in one case but not the other? And so it'd be great to do these parallel case studies.
Just a quick comment here.
Actually, I'll move on. I've sort of moved on a bit as well.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. My point actually relates to Claudia's. I understand culture, you're capitalizing on the environment because it's exogenous,
Right, yeah.
and more specifically physical environment. But I was actually wondering, because the geographic regions happen to overlap with areas that have historically been colonialized, and I know you've written lots of literature on this before, if you've kind of played around with data on that and seen how including some kind of measure for whether an area has been colonized or not, how that affects these other cultural indicators. And the reason I ask that is because I was thinking more at a very micro level in terms of how people will often defend more traditional cultural values because of these kind of external forces related to kind of globalization or kind of feeling this threat to their culture. And so I guess I was kind of wondering about that and all these other kind of ways that culture can change.
Right.
Whether that was maybe something important
Yeah,
to
yeah.
include or not.
Yeah. So no, I haven't looked at that, which would be interesting. There's different ways that colonization could come in. One is it's a shock akin to changes in temperature, so it's a change in the environment, and so maybe then it would change the importance of tradition. But the other one is kind of a natural experiment. So different areas were colonized. In which cases are they less likely to adopt a new system or be really resistant? And even there's differences across ethnic groups within countries or across villages. And so is that, would that be related to how stable the environment was in the past, how migratory they were, for example, how flexible they were? And so that would be the other way that one could study it. As a natural experiment, someone's coming in, they're telling you to do things differently to abandon your cultures. Missionaries, it doesn't have to be colonization, but missionaries coming in. And you could do this globally, actually. We know where missions were, and then how quickly were people to adopt to Christianity. And so there's kind of two ways that one could look at it. So so I think that's very fruitful area for future research.
Yeah. So very nice paper, enjoyed it. But I have a question about a couple of your empirical tables here, because you argue that when you use those interaction terms, that negative sign, it implies persistence. And I'm not sure that that's correct, because persistence to me essentially means that the coefficient on the same variable lag about whatever years would not be 1.
Would not be 1?
Yes.
It would be less or more?
It could be less, it could be more.
Okay.
So I think both of them would work against persistence.
Okay.
And in some of your tables, well, say the table 6, all right, in several equations, the direct term is greater than 1 significantly, and the interaction is negative. So it moves it back to 1 essentially.
Right, yeah.
So I think you might want to sort of explain it.
Yeah.
So why would that mean persistence?
Yeah. So it's a bit tricky empirically. So once you have control variables, right, then, so basically the way to think of this is there's a direct effect of historical female labor force participation on female labor force participation today, but we're including a bunch of control variables, right, which is female labor force participation interacted with those other things. So you have to take that into account, right, when you're seeing whether the coefficient is greater than 1 or less than 1. That's a technical point. So what you need to do is evaluate all those variables at the mean, and then see at the mean, what does the direct coefficient look like, right? So that happens in columns 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 when we're adding control variables. Right?
Yes.
And so I think that's the technical.
Well, say.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm looking at table 6 on polygamy.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at columns 5, 6, 7, and 8.
Okay. So on polygamy, yeah.
Yes. And I mean, I guess a simple way of doing it, right, would be to calculate marginal effects.
Exactly. Evaluate it at means. Yeah. Exactly.
Yes.
So,
but you don't do that.
No, that's right. That's right. So if people are looking at the paper, so take column 3 for example, right? And actually, let's take column 6. That's a nice example. So 6, it's above 1, right?
Yeah.
Which is exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's the direct effect of polygamy, right? And so that's polygamy in the future, polygamy today. But that's not the only place where polygamy is.
That's exactly.
You go further down. It's polygamy interacted with log GDP. So then you need to take into account, and you see that's negative.
I understand that.
Okay.
I understand that. But what I'm saying is, so have you calculated marginal effects?
No. So we should do that.
Because. So, and the other point is that whatever these other interaction terms are doing, the climate variability pushes this thing lower, and unless the other terms already pushed it under 1, right, it would be a problem, right?
Yeah. I'm sure for the vast, so the reason we didn't, I'm sure for the vast majority that the persistence is less than 1. So in the first column, where it's 0.3, that's going to be, so we're adding controls, but I think it's going to be very similar. But but so what we'll do is at the very bottom of the table, we'll have the marginal effects, the direct effect, and then the interaction. Yeah.
Do you have a related comment? Or? Okay. So it's Michael.
Yeah. This is a follow-up, I guess, in some ways on earlier questions. Environment doesn't have to be exogenous, of course, and culture can affect environment. So give you a specific example, fertility. Right? So fertility is a cultural phenomenon. Is it normal to have 8 kids, or is it normal to have 2? And if I only have 2, then something is wrong with me in one environment, and it's perfectly normal in another environment.
Yeah.
But so let's take it further and consider evolutionary aspects. So there may be competing cultures, and some may outcompete numerically, others may outcompete in terms of wealth. So it may turn out that having fewer children in some environments, which are all endogenous, as we understand, become wealthy. And so, where do we go from there? So the question then becomes, so what? So what are the implications? And then kind of a related thing is that, so you were talking about individual rationality of following culture. Sometimes, again, from evolutionary perspective, while individual rationality may even be lacking after environment has changed, there may be collective rationality. You can have a collective, a more cohesive collective, where people stick together and follow the same culture, same rules, as opposed to a less cohesive society where everyone is individually calculated.
Right.
So there are different directions to take it, and so the real question is, so what?
so what's a hard question to answer?
So
if you can refine it a little bit,
I learned from my son the difference between a good question and an excellent question. If you know the answer, that's excellent.
So the so what? Do you mean in terms of policy?
Implications.
Policy
I mean,
implications?
well, there are all these possibilities that
Yeah.
we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, certain type of culture is good individually, or may not be good anymore individually.
Right, yeah.
But then there are these other things that the effect of a culture on the environment, that culture shapes environment through fertility, through other model of marriage and so on.
Right.
Through cohesiveness, and so
Yeah.
let's look at competition of cultures, and that's very important.
Okay. Yeah. So you touch on a lot. Yeah. So that's one thing here is there's one group. There's no group level selection. So in other words, competition of cultures. So how well a certain cultural trait does at the group level, right, might be very different than the individual level. And if there's group level selection, societies are going to war with one another, then basically these group level beneficial cultures are going to be more likely to survive. And so that's an important extension. It's not in the model. The other thing that's not in the model is everyone's making their decisions individually, and basically whether their payoff has nothing to do with what everyone else around me is doing. So that would be another important extension. Is, well, there might be interactions, right? So if maybe everyone else in my society is violent, then maybe I need to be violent as well. That's not in the model. So these strategic social interactions. So those are two ways to enrich the model. And then the other thing you mentioned is transmission of successful cultures, right? So with intergroup competition or group level selection, then warfare is a natural thing. But at the individual level, there's transmission. We think of fitness, which is literally the number of kids you have. And so your example talks about this nicely. But the other way is transmission of norms that tend to be prestige bias, right? So people that are richer, then others are going to adopt those norms. So it's not literally just who has more kids, but who's more successful economically. And then your example highlights that. So I think the so what is, I guess, we should all go in these directions, and scholars, particularly economists, should be, who haven't gone at all in these directions, should be doing this. And I think why this is important, because I think there's lots of economics where they would just say, oh, culture doesn't exist. So that's first of all. And then that it doesn't evolve through some sort of process that we can model. And so this is putting down a model and saying, oh, it's consistent with the data, right? And so that's at least what we learn. That's a very first step. And then,
well, economists do write about ideology, and it is a form of a culture. Right? So some
do.
So some people, right? Yeah. So
some would say that's fluffy. That's not really.
Well, Roland Benabou writes a lot.
Yeah, but
ideology. So this is and in voting models, ideology is present. So rather than calculating, people follow certain ideological preferences.
Yeah, just what they think is right, exactly. And then what's important, I think, is to say, well, we can endogenize these, or endogenize the strength of an ideological belief. So usually in models it's assumed or it's not assumed, right? But I think we could do more about endogenizing. When would it be beneficial to have ideology? When wouldn't it be beneficial? So these models are along those lines, and I think one thing we're doing is saying, oh, well, these models that do that type of thing, they seem to be consistent with the data, or this one prediction.
Because of related comment?
Yeah, I guess to follow up on what you're saying, I think this is a nice, clean model that fits the data. Sort of, it's a good model to answer this question with this kind of data.
Yeah.
But relating to the point about interactions, I think, I think the standard economic game theory model of culture that I can certainly teach my undergrads and MBAs or whatever, would be that there are multiple equilibria. It's a coordination game. You can be speaking one language or another language. Which one you speak depends on your culture, because your best response depends on what everyone else does. So it's a very, very culturally embedded concept, not an individual belief oriented, as you seem to be focusing on, but very much about thinking the environment. Battle of the sexes. Literally, do the men win in this chicken game, or battle of the sexes or chicken, or do the women win?
Yeah.
Different equilibria means different best responses. So you can be thinking about it or not thinking about it at all. It's exactly the same equilibrium outcome. So we think about that a lot. Think about Sigma games. How do you show off your wealth? Big house, party for everybody, fancy clothes. We think about social learning games where, unlike in your model, the continuum of players choosing at the same time, you can get different outcome. You could have people not fishing in Iceland for a long time. because that is a possible equilibrium that's inefficient, that can maintain itself. So it seems like in economics, since for decades we've had a very rich model of culture, I think. And I'm sort of surprised the anthropology model seems so narrow in comparison.
Well, this is from 1985, so it's broad.
Back then, we had evolutionary models of multiple equilibria and shocks to them, and whether or not you bounce from one equilibrium to another, all those sort of models are from that era too. So I guess it seems like anthropology also could benefit from pulling in this economic or game theory view of culture, which is very embedded outward towards what people's expectations of you are, and people, following things not mechanistically because it's a better foraging method A or B, but because they feel if they pursue B, that would be considered inappropriate.
So the last thing you said,
an equilibrium result.
Right. So I guess the question is, so when we have these models, we can interpret them as, well, I think that's the right thing to do. So a Nash equilibrium is have calculated or not
or it's
calculated.
An evolutionary stable strategy.
Right.
Or a social learning outcome.
Right. So once you have, so think about evolutionary game theory. So when I was in grad school, I was very interested in evolutionary game theory. Read Jorgen Weibel, Peyton Young, but all my advisors said no. That's not, that won't get you a job. So you can do Nash equilibrium, that's fine, but why do you need evolutionary game theory, right? So why do you need to care about the dynamics? And so I think that's a little bit indicative of kind of where we are. So with Nash equilibrium, you could just say, oh, they sat down, they rationally thought of this, and then I think in reality,
it's just an equilibrium if they aren't rational at all as well.
Right.
But that's pretty, I don't know. We always teach that to undergrads.
Well, so I guess that would be the evolutionary game theory view, is there are different types, they're pretty fixed, they have ideologies, and then you're going to converge to these different equilibria, and then some are evolutionarily stable, others aren't, and then that's slightly different than Nash equilibria sometimes, right?
So you're interested in the transition.
The transition or models where you explicitly take a stance and say people have system one ways of thinking, right? They make decisions without even thinking, or they have ideologies, beliefs, religious beliefs, and then let's explicitly bring that into models. So Roland Benabou does this, but that's not, most models aren't going to have something in your utility function that's identity, or I get disutility if I deviate from my ideology.
So I guess my question is, a single coordination game, multiple equilibria, we all speak one language, or we speak another language, we have our holidays on this day, or we have holidays on another day. Is that not a model of culture?
I don't know. It depends on, to me, why people are, so those are models that will explain outcomes, right? And the question is, why are people doing those things? If they're doing it because they're motivated by internal values and beliefs, and that's being modeled, then that's culture. So if you think about a coordination game, why do we drive on the right-hand side of the road? In England, they drive on the left-hand side of the road, right? I don't know if that's motivated by culture.
Let's do it.
So what's that?
People don't have to think about it. It's not a choice.
Well, why was the very first time that I drove, right, did I decide to drive on the right-hand side of the road? And was it a cultural trait, or was it because my dad said those are the laws? If you don't want to hit somebody. And so it's really hard when you just observe the equilibrium outcome to know, is it a cultural trait, or is it because of the payoffs of the coordination game? So I think it's tricky, but I think, and then the other thing I would think about is, there is behavior we observe in the world. So as I'm sure you know, the ultimatum game, people don't. Yeah.
We think of repeated games as very much culture. What will happen to you? Your reputation is very much.
No. But in the ultimatum game, it's one shot. People understand that, but they don't behave. And why is that? Well, because they have rules of thumb, a heuristics culture that they're bringing into the game. That doesn't mean those heuristics aren't formed by repeated games, which is I think what you're thinking, right? But I guess recognizing that our decisions are made with this thing that's called culture and ideology. But of course, and this is what the anthropologists do and be consistent with what you're saying exactly, is, well, those are determined as equilibrium outcomes. And so I think it's a tiny step from exactly what you're talking about to what these guys are doing, right? And so.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first one is from Dean Luke, so I'm returning a favor here. Most of the semester, Dean has been asking my questions, and I've been following online, so today we reverse the roles. Dean is flying back from Montana. So his question is, your main idea is that instability undermines traditions and culture, but this is not possible that an unstable environment would generate a stable tradition adapted to that natural variability. So what seems to be missing here is how the environment determines the structure of the traditions. Okay, so that's his question. My question, I was a little bit concerned about potential selection in the empirical part. What about if being traditional or not traditional is also connected with your willingness to move? So if I'm a traditionalist, I want to stay close to my homeland. If I'm not, I'm more willing to move. And it seems that you suggest at some point that more stable environments are the ones are better in some sense, although it's not pretty clear. So maybe you want to move from the more unstable to the more stable environments, but this is not the same for everybody. So suddenly you can have selection in your regressions, even if it's completely exogenous, the environmental change. No? And maybe it goes in your favor. So you're estimating a lower bound, but I'm not quite sure. So I think that's something to think about.
So let me answer yours. So it turns out in the model, that's right. So in the model, the aggregate welfare utility is independent of delta, the instability. So you can look at the figure. It's just pi plus b minus c, always, right? It affects p. And so, if you it depends on how seriously you want to take the model. So here, the model predicts you wouldn't move. In reality, with unstable environments, this is, I think, we need to do more empirically along these lines. If you have a very unstable environment, it's plausible to think that you're going to be weaker. You're susceptible to more shocks. Maybe you're more willing to move. That's going to cause lower tradition, or lower importance placed on tradition, or you're more likely to be taken over by another society and forced to. So I think all of those move in the same direction. They're slightly different mechanisms, but this is something we need to look at. So one thing we can do is we've collected historical conflict data, at least for Europe, and we can look back in time and see when there are these shocks, do you see more conflicts in that location? And also we have historical state boundary data and similar. And that would be, kind of consistent with the model, a slightly different mechanism, and so we should need to understand that. So, and then I'm missing, so Dean's question is kind of interesting because, so he says, well, if you're in an unstable environment, can't you develop a cultural trait that develops with that instability? And the answer is yes, that is valuing tradition less, being more flexible. So in some sense, that's another way of stating the mechanism is in an unstable environment, we're not as tied to what we were doing in the past. We're going to develop some flexibility. And so you can imagine, you could have shocks, or you can have something that's trending upward. Maybe agricultural productivity is trending down, so you're going to change, or fishing's getting better and agricultural productivity is getting worse. Then the cultural trait is, well, we're going to be flexible. We're going to deviate a little bit more each period from, and then that's basically the model. So in some ways, it's saying yes, that he's exactly right.
Just on that quickly, I mean, I think of like the Maasai, where you've had extremely unstable weather fluctuations for forever. And they're very traditionalists, and they're always moving. And the same for a lot of Native Americans who you could take the tribes, let's say down in New Mexico, the Pueblo tribes that are very stable, but then right above them were ones who were hunting buffalo, and they were always moving around. And one doesn't seem any more traditional than the other. One part of their tradition is the environment's very unstable. So our tradition is we got to pick up and move all the time.
Exactly.
But it doesn't. Other than that, does that say anything about instability?
Right. An important thing is what kind of instability, and we were kind of careful.
Yeah, that's fair.
So if it's within my lifetime, there's a lot of shocks year to year, then exactly. And so the question is from one generation to the next. So let's say the tribes that were migratory, suddenly things became changed and
So instability can be stable.
Yeah, exactly.
Stable instability is...
Exactly. So we could measure, if we had to find enough data, within 20-year intervals, what's the variance? And then across 20-year periods, across generations, how much did that variance change? And that would capture...
That'd be easy,
Another related question.
Yeah, just it's not a question. I wonder if you know Odette Galour's work. Yeah, so I think it could be relevant. I mean, it's a study. Yeah, over the years, kind of building economics of ancient history. And so he and his co-authors do work with models of that nature, and I thought it was relevant. So
it's definitely relevant.
Another
So my comment is on basically that variance and also on some uncertainty with the data. So if you look at the original man data set, it's constructed from like 1,000 tree ring places and 100 ice cores, but it's totally missing large parts of Africa. It's missing Brazil. So you would imagine that the uncertainty, or excuse me, that you're going to have a worse measurement of, let's say, the 5 kilometer grid you're using in Africa than you are in North America, where you have all these tree rings remaining. And perhaps that uncertainty, so you're going to get the measurement error is related to the overall climate change because there's been some large shock that's wiped out the ability to keep that information. So maybe you could just plot, distance from the closest center and then the variance. Data, and if there's some relationship there, then you've got something to clean up. If not, then you're good to go. And then also on that point, given that these are all smoothed within complicated models, I think you're just taking the point estimate for the temperature, but I think you need to incorporate the uncertainty around the measurement process, like the smoothing process itself, using some multiple imputation. I'm worried that the variation might be related in the higher variance area. You might be missing the variation in the higher variance areas. If that makes sense.
That's right. So that's exactly right. So we don't know. Certain parts of the world you have less data. So first, we don't know whether that's going to make you more variable, less variable over generations, and then how that's related to tradition. And so if those things all lined up in a certain way, that could explain our results. And so this is one reason I think Lee and I were talking about this. It's not one piece of evidence is kind of like, foolproof, but then, the fact that we looked at within the U.S., and if you look at the map, there's, the
U.S. is good.
The U.S. is very good, right? And then Canada is very good as well. Not quite as good as the U.S., but that when we looked at Native American tribes, that lines up similarly, and then replicate that in Canada.
Yeah, and also your stuff from in the 70s on, I'm not worried about. I'm just worried, like, if the one, I think it was in like Tanzania, if the one data point you have for Tanzania is like driving all of Africa, well, maybe that's going to be less variable than the places that are,
So.
It's a very quick comment, and then.
I had the same comment, especially on tail risk. So you really care, I think, about negative outcomes, not positive outcomes, right? I mean, if the climate, if the variance is driven by a lot of warm weather, and then a little bit cold weather, you really want the tail risk in this, and how big that shock is. I mean, I don't know the nature of this data, but the whole thing strikes me as predictable in some ways.
The data or the result?
Well, no. I mean, the climate instability is, if it's predictable, then it may have less of an effect on tradition than if that variance itself is unpredictable.
Right, how predictable it is.
How predictable. So
so we could do that is look across based on lagged variables how predictable it is.
But if I got a tradition about farming and we're talking about different degrees of length of warm weather, it's not much of a variance. On the other hand, if I get a lot of cold spells, that's a problem. So it's negative outcomes that are a problem for whatever it is objective that traditions try to do.
So it really does. So we can do more of this. We wanted to start with this because if you said, we care about variability in the environment, the first thing that's going to pop into your mind is variance or standard deviation. If we did something more complicated, people would be a bit suspicious. So that's right. I think what you said is exactly right, but that's for Europe. That's a Western perspective. In much of the tropical world, it's warmer temperatures with drought. That's actually
droughts for sure.
And so there's no rainfall data, otherwise we would. But the point is we can do more to look at other moments of the data. Exactly. And we can test that. We can see empirically.
That was actually my question.
Okay. So then the gentleman over there.
I want to ask you a little bit about the data and then what you did with it, and kind of picking up on Alex's point, which is, Mann was pretty heavily criticized when he first started publishing this. When I say heavily criticized, there was a division.
Okay.
Right? And it might be interesting to go back and look at that. Ross McKittrick basically took finally got hold of Mann's data and started rerunning it and saying, there are lots of ways to interpret this data.
Okay.
And Mann came up with one approach. McKittrick came up with something quite different.
Okay.
This then led to a whole series of recalculations.
Yeah.
And while most of those supported the general pattern that Mann came up with, there was a lot of variation across it.
Okay.
So it might be, if that's one of your primary explanatory variables,
Yep.
you might want to spend a little time on the interpretation of that data itself. Where did
Yeah.
it come from and how much variability is there in that measure
Right.
of temperature variation over time? Which, and the next question, or that's a comment, an observation. A question related to it is the extent to which you use the data as a time series, rather than, it looks like you took, what's the variability across 70 generations?
Yeah, exactly.
And there's my
measure for
independent variable. But I'm sitting here wondering, well, I don't think that something that happened 1,400 years ago actually changes my culture today. In fact, I don't think anything more than 300 years ago affects my culture today. I'm not sure even that. Did you use this? Did you?
Yeah.
I couldn't get it from the paper on the brief reading.
Yeah.
Did you use it at all as a time series?
We've looked at it. So I guess one comment is, so that's possible. It could be 300 years earlier.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
Which would be a kind of a compromise between time series and 1,400 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's just look at the last 300 years if we're looking at behavior today.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so it's an empirical question. I could ask you why how you came up with the 300-year number.
I know.
But but it is, and I probably have a number that's much longer. And so we have looked at it. You can use, so we broke it up basically. There's a medieval warming period. There's prior to the medieval warming. Then there's a little ice age, and then post-little ice age. If you break it up, basically those measures of instability across generations are pretty highly correlated. So it's going to be 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 plus. And so you can use any measure. So you could look at, for example, 500 to 1000 AD, and you're going to get predictive power, the same patterns. But that doesn't mean that necessarily 500, you could still be right, because that's just correlated with instability. And so you can do that, but because of the high correlation, it's really hard to say anything definitive. You could throw them all in a regression, but then it's just kind of luck, I think, which one becomes
Well, and that actually brings me to the real question, which is, what are you not telling us? So you looked at polygamy.
Yeah.
You looked at female participation in labor force. What else did you test?
So that's
not in here.
That's it. If anyone has ideas, the tricky thing is you need, for those types of regressions, you need a variable that was measured a long time ago and then the same measure today. So it's really hard to think of. Those two we could get. So if there's anyone that has ideas, we're definitely willing to test it.
I actually find that more convincing than the alternative, which was, I was thinking, well, given my concerns about the quality of the independent variable, the time, the temperature variability, I was thinking, well, if that's the case, then if I test enough dependent variables,
that's true.
I'll find some that are, that behave properly for my theory. But you're saying you only tested these two?
Yeah, these are the only two we tested. So you can think about what anthropological measure would we know about from the ethnographic atlas, and then we can also measure today. And so there's very few.
We only have a couple of minutes. We have one question from here.
Excuse me, maybe my question will seem stupid, but I'm not from the field of economics. But if I understand well, your underlying assumption that what makes culture good or bad for you is it that culture is economically successful, right?
No. Economically
successful.
Useful.
So whether a particular cultural practice is going to survive in the long run has to do with whether, how beneficial it is. It doesn't have to be, whether these people will die. So imagine there's a cultural practice that I should eat these blueberries, which are poisonous. That cultural practice isn't going to survive very long. So that has nothing to do with economics, but it's relative costs and benefits. Yeah.
And the last question.
Right. Well, this is to do with the data, and again, maybe this is just one to end on. I don't know if you come up with a definitive answer. One of the interesting things I think about your chart, Figure 5, for example, is that basically it seems all the countries with that are relatively stable are poor. And I mean, mostly the poor countries and most of the wealthy countries are on the unstable side.
Yeah.
And I guess that raises sort of two questions. One is that, I mean, I think that's just an interesting phenomenon to begin with, and that could be a problem with the data. I mean, there's some various issues that have been raised. It could be something fundamental that really is explaining, long-term differences in levels of wealth or something like that. But it also, I think, presents a challenge for your estimation, because I know you're trying to control for country level income, but there's going to be a lot of things that aren't controlled for that are going to be correlated with income level. But anyway, I thought that was just a very interesting pattern, and whether you want to say something about it now or not, you can maybe later.
Okay, maybe later.
We are over time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you.